Alright guys, Murph's here, and today we're going to talk about 5.56 versus the 308. Now before we get too far into this conversation, I do want to go ahead and identify some terms as well as get a couple of caveats out of the way. So first off, I'm going to refer to the 7.62 by 51mm NATO, more commonly called the 7.62 NATO, as the 308 cartridge, 308 Winchester specifically. And I'm doing so because first off, though there are some differences between 7.62 NATO and 308 Winchester, they're not necessarily critical to the conversation that we're having right now. And in addition to that, there's a lot of different 7.62mm cartridges out on the market. I don't want someone to get confused in the overall progression of this conversation and get lost on what it is that we're talking about. So I will use a drastically different term because I have the opportunity to be able to do so, away from other cartridges that might pop up in this conversation overall. This way no one gets confused thinking that I might be talking about 7.62 by 3.9 when I am most definitely talking about 308 Winchester or any other 7.62mm cartridge. Now, as far as caveats are concerned, I am going to discuss a couple of rifles during this video. Keep in mind that this is not a rifle review video. This is any of the comments that I make about those rifles is not capturing all of my thoughts. That's not what we're doing. We're not doing a review of those guns. What we're doing is using those guns to be able to identify different aspects of the cartridges and what makes them either successful or perhaps some things that they struggle with. Now, another caveat being is that this video has two very distinct portions of it. Has two very distinct portions of it. The first one being the very objective, data-fueled portion with lots of numbers and different statistics and all that type of stuff. And then there's the very subjective, contextual aspect where we take that information and then make it make sense to what it is that things look like in real life. Keep in mind, guys, people in cartridge debates have a tendency to get really stuck on the data aspect of it and really leave out the contextual part and how any of that data actually applies to something and has meaning or derives meaning from. So this is going to be based off of my experiences with the cartridges, which I have an extensive amount of experience with both cartridges. So with those things out of the way, let's go ahead and get into the video. So in the late 1950s, NATO decided that they wanted to standardize around a common cartridge and perhaps a rifle platform as well. This way, troops in the field, especially if the big one ever kicked off with Russia, would be able to pull from the same supply train, and space on that supply train would be optimized by not having to have multiple different types of equipment or ammunition for everybody who's in that particular AO. So kind of like if you had French and British troops sharing the same section of a line and a supply train came in and they hopped in there and all the ammunition that showed up turned out to be for the 303 British and the French didn't have anything that chambered that cartridge, that wouldn't be very advantageous to anybody. You're talking about like a third globe spanning war, maybe it's better to optimize things this time around so that everyone can pull from the same supply train. There's a lot of stuff that makes sense right there. Now, the problem is getting that many countries to agree on a rifle platform as well as a cartridge. Now, the US would be dead set that we needed to maintain a 30 caliber full power rifle cartridge. However, what they did manage to do to kind of like meet everybody on the middle ground was design a cartridge that was shorter than a lot of the full power rifle cartridges at the time so that it would better fit into a semi-automatic weapon system. So what they did was they took the 30-06 and they shrank it down a little bit and managed to, by use of the latest in propellants, be able to pull the same velocity and energy characteristics of a 30-06 out of this new 308 Winchester cartridge, 7.62 by 51mm NATO, as mentioned before. Now, America finally gets everybody to agree that this is the cartridges that they're going to adopt, and then America adopts a rifle chambered in it, the M14, which kind of has a similar layout to the M1 Garand, and the most visual difference between the two being the addition of a 20-round detachable box magazine. But there's also some minor functional changes as far as how the gas system works, as well as the addition of full automatic fire. Well, this is all fantastic, right? We now have a detachable box magazine. We have a shorter cartridge, which means that we can have a shorter action, which allows the rifle to be a little bit lighter, and it'll work better with magazines. Magazines will be lighter. It'll take up less space. Everything's all pluses, right? And now we have the ability to be able to keep pushing out effective fire to 500 yards that'll still drop a man. Everything's good, right? up until the US got embroiled in Vietnam, at which point it would turn out that combat would not take place at 500 yards as though you were fighting in the Volga Gap against Russians. It would actually be jungle warfare, and jungle warfare that was very indicative of hit and fade operations as well as ambushes. Now, for those of you who don't know, in an ambush you've got two options: assault through and destroy the enemy, or break contact and regroup. Either option requires large volumes of fire and fire superiority in order to be able to overwhelm the enemy and actually maneuver. That's how maneuver is conducted in the battle space. Once battle is joined, you need to have fire superiority in order to be able to move. The problem is that you have to have a weapon system that's conducive to giving you that fire superiority. That's why bolt actions went out of style. Now, the M14 is a far cry from a bolt action, that's for sure. However, it's not necessarily the best in full automatic fire. The issue, and I've never fired a full auto M14. I have viewed quite a few videos on the matter. I've read a couple of manuals. And the problem with full auto fire in the M14 is that it's incredibly difficult to maintain control of. The muzzle has a tendency to want to rise, as things do in full automatic fire. And you wind up having to really drive your body against the weapon system and get your body behind it in order to be able to keep it on path with the target. It's possible. However, if you're trying to take cover, if you're trying to engage from the prone position, you might have some issues trying to keep that weapon on target. And when you're trying to gain fire superiority, the only hits that count are either on or near the target in order to be able to keep them behind cover. If your weapon system's not tracking flat for that, it's going to make it really difficult. Now, that is very different from what the Vietnamese were armed with, which would be either Simonov SKSs, the Chinese Type 56 AK, or RPD machine guns. All of these chambered in 7.62x3.9. Now, the real problem is the Type 56 in combination with the RPD. Those weapon systems, being in an intermediate cartridge, are fairly easy to keep on target and also have the capability for full auto fire in the AK-47. So a squad of US troops armed with an M60 and a bunch of M14s versus a squad of North Vietnamese troops with an RPD and a bunch of AK-47s, the squad with the AKs is going to win. They're going to be able to produce more firepower faster than anybody else is. More effective firepower. That's the key thing here. And in general, I'm very curious as to what drove the US towards wanting to maintain a full power rifle cartridge when they had to have seen the STG-44 during World War II. Now, I think there are a couple of things that impacted that. This is a little bit of a rabbit hole, but I thought it'd be kind of fun to talk about. So, the Russian army in World War II pulled a lot of attention from the Germans. The Eastern Front was a massive demand on German supply capabilities, weapons, material, personnel, all that type of stuff. That was a huge drain, and that was one of the reasons that everyone was interested in keeping Russia in the fight, because they were pulling so much German attention to begin with. With that being the case, the Germans were sending a lot of their new technology that direction as soon as it came out. So the largest fielding of the STG-44 was on the Eastern Front. Sure, they made it over to the Western Front, but most of them would go to the Eastern Front. So the Russians got very intimate with the STG-44 and the 7.92mm by 33 Kurtz cartridge. And they would decide that this was something that they wanted to expand upon and would develop the 7.62x3.9 before World War II was even done. The Allies, on the other hand, seemed to have viewed the STG-44 as kind of like an overgrown submachine gun and felt that it had no real place in modern warfare. And as we see how these two very different conclusions meet in Vietnam, we kind of see who had the better overall thought process there. If the fighting had been at 500, 100% the M14 would have ruled the day. But as it turns out, nobody wins a war by playing to the enemy's strengths. So the US would wind up finally having to take a designer named Eugene Stoner seriously, who had managed to be able to put together an aluminum and plastic rifle, not wood and steel, firing a souped-up .22 caliber cartridge that was an adaptation of the .222 Remington, today known as the .223 Remington, which was moving at roughly 3,200 feet per second, a little extra, in a lighter overall platform. This is very interesting. So let's go ahead and get into like the data-driven aspect of this discussion. So the original M80 ball cartridge is a 147 grain 30 caliber projectile moving at about 2,800 feet per second versus the M193 ball cartridge, which is a 55 grain projectile moving at the aforementioned 3,200 feet per second. So let's go ahead and roll in a chart and kind of take a look at drop and velocity, energy, all that type of stuff. So as we can see, at about, well, at sub 200 yards, the two cartridges are pretty much neck and neck. However, once we get out to around that 160 to 200 time frame, the 308 starts to drop off, and the 5.56 seems to have an overall flatter trajectory, but it also pretty distinctly drops, and they kind of actually match each other in overall trajectory. It's kind of interesting how they seem to lose steam at a similar time. However, if we look at this chart here, we can see that the 5.56 massively drops velocity as it goes, and thereby energy, which is already kind of starting off at a bit of a deficit with the 55 grain projectile. The 308 is almost 3 times heavier. And this, on the other hand, maintains a fantastic amount of energy, 1,000 foot-pounds at 500 yards. As opposed to the just over 300 foot-pounds of energy that the 5.56 is amassing. 5.56 at this point is more or less a 9mm, but smaller in energy output. Whereas the 308 is still very much so a very viable cartridge at 500 yards. That's a pretty distinct difference right there. And we really see how the 308 kind of takes the day on this with its greater mass and actually maintains higher overall velocity as well. Very interesting. Higher velocity in terms of distance. At the muzzle, it's very different. There's still quite a while where the 5.56 outpaces it, but eventually it gives up that ghost. Now, how does this kind of go into the contextual aspect with 308? Well, 308 is a fantastic barrier defeating cartridge. It really has a great dynamic with punching through armor and all that type of stuff, which also makes it fantastic for challenging someone's body armor solution. Now, body armor has become incredibly prevalent in the world today, be it civilian use in America or also military use all across the world. In the last 20 years, body armor has become a mandatory thing in militaries. And even if your plates are rated to 7.62 AP, it doesn't really matter because that energy still has to go somewhere. So yeah, cool, you don't have a penetrating gunshot wound, but you still have some blunt force trauma going on when that round dumps its energy into you. I've known 2 guys who've taken hits to the plates, and both of them needed medical attention. One of them had a pretty nasty internal bleed going on once they got to him. So he's alive. He's alive today. I'm not saying anything about that. I'm just saying everyone has a tendency to think that bulletproof vests give them some sort of like Star Wars type deflector shield, when the reality is physics still apply. And if you don't have somebody nearby to render aid to you, it doesn't really matter that you had body armor on to begin with. Just something to think about. But let's get off that rabbit hole and get back into the cartridge discussion here. Now, what are some advantages of the 5.56? Well, weight. It is a smaller cartridge overall, shorter, smaller in every conceivable way. And this is where the 308 being 3 times heavier than the 5.56 is kind of to its detriment. The 5.56 being lighter overall means that you can fit more ammunition into the space that you have allocated for ammunition, be it in a pack or on a vest, in your magazine pouches, whatever it may be. You're going to be able to cram more ammunition into it. I carried a 308 at one point, and everyone else around me had 5.56. And I was distinctly aware of the fact that my on-hand ammunition was half the amount of everyone else. That I had readily accessible in the same overall space that everyone else had allocated to their ammunition. I had half the amount of ammunition. That's not so bueno. Depending on where it is that you're going, what it is that you're doing, you might need more ammo than that. And ultimately, if you switch over to 5.56, even in the same space and weight allocated to that ammunition, you're going to have more. Something to consider overall. Now, in addition to being a lighter weight overall cartridge, it's also exceedingly light recoiling. Now, that's not to say that 308 is some sort of shoulder bruiser. However, the 5.56 is an extremely pleasant cartridge to shoot in the terms of you don't have a lot of shift to your sights. So that makes it easier to shoot at great distance with it because you're able to better observe impacts, as well as it's easier to be able to run it in short range type situations where you're trying to really hammer that target, you're trying to drive into the gun and all that kind of stuff. You're going to have less sight disturbance and a faster overall shooting cadence to allow to really stack those hits on whatever it is that you're going after. That might be something that's really important to you. Now, in terms of velocity with the 5.56, and there's always the kind of that third dimension to ballistics, right? So you have velocity and energy and mass and all that type of stuff that you have to take into account. But it doesn't really talk about wound track. So that's kind of like the wild card in pistol ballistics, where you have hollow points and soft points and all that type of stuff to expand and be able to create more damage within the target media. How does the 5.56 perform in target media? Well, upon impact, the 5.56 at a certain velocity threshold has a tendency to yaw. Now, what is a yaw other than a thing that everyone says to each other in karate movies? Yaw is the tendency for the bullet to destabilize in the target media, turn sideways, begin to roll, and then also, at the right velocity, start to come apart, which means that you have additional wound channels being generated. Now, in general, whenever we're talking about high velocities and all that kind of stuff, we have another relationship we have to take into account, which is the secondary wound track, which is that initial impact, the initial displacement of all that type of media, and then how the bullet performs through different air and fluid-filled gaps in the human body. 5.56 has an excellent relationship with this as long as the velocity is high. And that threshold for that optimal fragmentation of the bullet as it begins to kind of get sideways and all that kind of stuff happens at 2,600 feet per second. Now, if you look back at our chart, that 2,600 feet per second threshold is sub 200 yards, about like 180, 190 yards roughly is where we hit 2,600 feet per second. So anything beyond that, the bullet has a higher probability of a less drastic yaw and less bullet fragmentation. Doesn't mean it's going to stop, it just means that it's not optimal. And actually, I found a chart that kind of lays out at different distances what the 5.56 recovered round looks like. It's kind of interesting. So, that's that kind of third dimension of ballistic performance out of the 5.56 that's difficult to take into account, and what makes it not the best barrier penetrator, but maybe that's what you're after. Maybe you don't want to potentially kill the entire neighborhood because somebody entered the house in the middle of the night. I'm not saying that the 5.56 won't overpenetrate. I'm saying that the 5.56 has a very different relationship with overpenetration. Now, there's been a lot of study that's been put into trying to make the 5.56 a better barrier penetrator with the M855 and the M855A1, but it doesn't mean that it's all that successful, honestly. It's better than nothing. It's better than the M193, which had absolutely terrible barrier performance, but it doesn't really translate that well overall. Now let's talk about some disadvantages of the 308. Well, the issue with the 308 comes down to weight. And whenever I'm talking about weight and all this type of stuff and recoil, what I'm really thinking about are close quarters combat and shooting around barriers, trying to get into unnatural positions. The lighter recoiling aspect of the 5.56 makes it easier to be able to keep it on target, as well as being able to shoot from unorthodox positions like rollover prone or something like that. In the 308, it's generally going to be a heavier recoiling cartridge. Sorry guys, it's raining outside. It's been a very, very wet spring so far. It's going to have a heavier recoil output, which might make it more difficult to kind of drive that rifle in and hold it steady whenever you're doing CQB type operations and you're burning through a mag on somebody. Now, that might just be hundredths of a second, and if you train or optimize your rifle for that type of purpose, you can work around it. Just realize that it might be something that you have to work around it, where you might not have to work as much around an intermediate cartridge like the 5.56. Same thing for shooting from unorthodox positions. You can do it, it just might take a little bit more time or effort or accessory to be able to pull that type of thing off. This is where you got to make that evaluation of, is the juice worth the squeeze in this case? Now, in addition to that, generally your 308 rifles are going to be fairly heavy. And a 5.56, where you're talking about being able to easily hit around 7 pounds with a fully outfitted rifle, in a 308 you're looking at closer to 8. There are a couple of guns that kind of flirt with that line, the Scar Heavy being an excellent example of a fairly lightweight 308 rifle. But you have to pursue that. And the Scar Heavy is pretty expensive overall, whereas your AR-10 is definitely going to be 8 pounds, probably heavier. So, something to consider about that overall. It's not necessarily a constant as much as it's something to take into account. It's going to be a beefier, heavier gun, most likely. Most likely. There's always onesie twosies outsiders. Now, disadvantage of the 5.56 comes back to the velocity thing, losing all that energy once it gets out to distance. Outside of 300 yards, I don't think the 5.56 is that great of an option. There has to be other things that drive me towards a 5.56 at that point. Now, ammunition selection would help out in this overall process. Some 77 grain Mark II.62 OTMs, that's a pretty fantastic cartridge. That is great for pushing out to distance. It's what it was built around with the Mark 12 SPR. However, that ammunition is also kind of expensive. And especially now, currently, it might even be difficult to find. In addition to that, at the end of the day, you're still throwing a 22 caliber bullet, albeit a very large one, a very great distance. You're not getting optimal performance out of the cartridge at this point. It's not what it was designed for, and it's kind of being pushed beyond its limits at that point. It's out of its comfort zone at those distances. It's not to say that you can't do it. Just like running a 308 in a close quarters type situation, you can do it. You just might have to spend more time optimizing, practicing, and really playing through that dynamic of what is it that I'm succeeding. Ultimately, hits on target count. You put a hole in somebody that wasn't there originally, they're going to notice. And it's probably going to put them out of the fight. The question becomes, is it really worth everything else to not have more energy on target once it gets there? Now, from a hunting standpoint, the 308 wins hands down, 100%. The 308 with proper bullet selection is going to be pretty much good for everything in North America. The 5.56 or 223 at this point, on the other hand, is considered marginal for white-tailed deer. In a lot of places, completely illegal to hunt with white-tailed deer, and other places discouraged. However, it's a great varmint cartridge. It performs very well in that capacity. I think the bottom line on this discussion overall, guys, is that you have to keep in mind what the cartridges do well. 308 is a great long-range cartridge. And if you're going up against body armor, 308 starts to make sense as well to try to optimize it for that close quarters type combat. However, 5.56 is fantastic at close range, as most intermediate cartridges are, and may not necessarily be the best at long range. But if you're more concerned about perhaps having a lightweight setup and being able to flex into that longer range category, but you're mostly going to be shooting at close range, perhaps 5.56 is the better overall option. I think of it in terms of 300 yards. If I'm going to fight at 300 yards and below, I want an intermediate cartridge. If I'm going to consistently fight at 300 and beyond, I want a 308 or 6.5 Creedmoor, something along those lines, something with a little bit more energy, something that's going to perform better at those distances. If I need something to flex into both, that's where you have to decide where your time is going to be best spent, either trying to optimize and figure out how to run a 7.62 in close quarters type operations, or take the easy road with the intermediate cartridge. That's a very subjective thing, and I wouldn't necessarily put one ahead of the other as much as to say it might be easier with an intermediate cartridge overall. Now, guys, I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on the subject overall. So, with that, I hope you guys found this helpful, and have a good day.